All right, welcome. We're here today with Dr. Maria Sophia Aguirre, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of America. She specializes in international finance and economic development, and we're going to have a discussion today about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they relate to Catholic social teaching and the concept of integral human development or integral economic development. So Dr. Aguirre, welcome. A pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Eduardo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So why don't we begin a little bit? Could you tell us about the Sustainable Development Goals on a broad level, sort of what they are, what they entail, what were the perceived crises or threats that brought about the need to articulate them, and what does applying them entail?
Okay, so the Sustainable Development Goals were set up in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly. And it was a continuation or building up on the millennial goals that were set up for the 15 years before preceding the Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea is to provide kind of an outline, right? A blueprint, as they call it, to achieve more sustainable development for the future. The millennial goals overall are considered that they did achieve or improve in reducing poverty, but still we have a lot of space to improve, and especially to do so in a manner that it is sustainable, right? I think that too often in those of us who work in economic development, whether it is in the field or at the policy level, we see that we may do an intervention and then it doesn't, once the institution helping leaves, the intervention falls apart. And so when we think sustainability, that's what we are trying to do, right? To introduce interventions in a way, and I think that that's the key, is in the way and in a way that unleashes that proactive participation as opposed to just a help.
Okay.
So the Millennial Development Goals idea is that this framework will help to achieve precisely that.
Got it. And so is the main goal overall reduction in poverty, or what are kind of the super end goals at play?
Well, again, the Sustainable Development Goals idea is precisely to reduce poverty, but not only that, right? Reduce poverty, but together, so by providing basic needs like hunger, right? Overcome hunger, health, well-being, education. But it's also engaging other aspects such as clean water and sanitation, right? Energy, affordable energy or sustainable energy. And together with that, climate change, addressing climate change issues or potential of climate change issues, but also does address better, if you ask me, than the Millennium Development Goals, issues that are very important for economic development, such as investment, such as the responsible consumption and production. And that only, that only refers not to the developing world, but also to the developed world. So in that sense, the Sustainable Development Goals encompasses everyone around the world, not only the developing countries where the greater presence of poverty is.
Okay, great. And so when you mentioned, the reason they're called sustainable is maybe there's been some history at play of interventions that really only work, and then maybe the infrastructure comes out of it. Could you tell us a little bit of what has been some of that history of maybe interventions that failed to kind of sustain and take on a life of their own?
Well, I think that this is a fascinating evolution in the field of development, in fact. But this is what has happened. For years, we have tried to, when I say we, I mean for people working in development, both as a policy level and at the field level, and everybody in between. We have tried to solve solutions with a very reductionist way of thinking, and seeking more often than not a quick result, precisely because the need is very dear. I mean, you see it, right? There's people starving right there, so you want to solve the problem now. the problem with that, or if we did some more long-term interventions, the assumption always is a very reductionist understanding of the economic agent, where he or she will maximize as a self-utility maximizer. As a consequence of that, what has happened is that the outcomes have been inefficient. Not only inefficient in the short term, but they have not been sustainable. Often we do not address the reality of the person in need, which is who is not a self-utility maximizer, but a person who is social by nature and therefore maximizes as such. And also we forget to think about how do we strengthen through this intervention the institutions around that intervention that would sustain them in the long run. To give you an idea, you can teach somebody to read, but if that kid, after they learn how to read, all the options is to be a gang member or a drug dealer, then there's not going to be much more than just the reading, right? And perhaps the reading will be used in the wrong way if he's not killed before that. And so, or ends up emigrating because of the conditions in the community where they live. And so what has happened now is in economics is that we have realized two things. One, we really do not understand how the economic agent really works and maximizes. And two, institutions are fundamental. But then what has happened is that, well, okay, let's work on the institutions, but we really do not engage the individuals, the persons in that society in a way that they make it their own. So let's make a democracy, right? We write the document, but then do people really engage in a democratic manner, right? Do they understand the rules of law, etc.? And so what has happened in the past 20 years in economic development, especially I would say coming from the research side, but impacting now the field, is that we have begun to look for alternative solutions to really understand how the economic agent works. And this is the work of Banerjee, Duflo, these are Carlan, all the Nobel Prizes of last year, right? I mean, so it has been revolutionary for economics because now we realize that using data and the way we understand the economic agent needs to be much more integrated, right? That sounds familiar, right? Because this is what the social doctrine of the church teaches, right? What we need to seek is integral economic development, not just the GDP. It's not good enough. We need it, but not good enough. And not only that, is how we achieve that increase in GDP is key. And so today, the integral economic development is, as proposed by the social doctrine of the church, certainly it resounds across our field. The catch there is that sometimes what we understand as integral development or sustainable development, so what we understand for sustainable development is not equal to integral development, in that is more understood as rights and empowerments and definitions than actually engaging in a proactive and participatory manner in a way that really changes the way I live, not only how much money I make. And therefore, in the process of doing that, building the institutional setting at all levels, right? Family, social engagement, and civic engagement that really will provide that lasting impact after the intervention finishes or the money invested finishes.
So if I could synthesize a little bit what I'm hearing, it sounds like in part there's this, assumption of man as, I liked how you put it, the self-interested,
self-utility maximizer.
Utility maximizing. So yeah, so it's this idea of man always acting rationally in a particular way towards economic ends, and maybe in reality, what you're saying is the human person, especially as understood by Catholic teaching, is much more nuanced and complex, right? Has a fallen aspect, which means we don't always act in our self-interest, but also has greater aspirations than simply maximizing utility.
Well, in fact, I would say that, and this is one of the things we do in integral economic development, I would say that maximizing as a self-utility maximizer is inefficient. Where the mainstream assumption of economic development, it is that that's to be efficient, right? Efficient means being autonomous, not bothering anybody. And when in reality, what we are learning in economic analysis is that in fact, we depend from one another, and that's not a problem, right? And in fact, when you try to be autonomous, that's when is the problem. Look at the aging population that we have. What is that reflective of, right? And so in fact, we are efficient when we act, we maximize, not as a self-utility maximizer, but as a social person. I like to put concrete example, because I think that helps and hits home. If we were self-efficient, self-utility maximizers, when a father of a family thinks if they're going to take this job or not, or is going to work this amount of hours or not, normally is not thinking about himself alone. If you do, very soon you're going to have a divorce, right? What you think about, which is also very inefficient. What you think about is in your wife and your children. And precisely when you look at that family as a unit, is that you are efficient in your outcomes. But economic theory tells us that you have to think. This is interesting because we use the right words and we empty, right? We talk about the household. We don't talk about the economic, right? It's the household, but that household is not made up of self-utility maximizers. It's made up of human beings who have an organic unit and that maximizes in such a way, right? You can translate this in, you can translate this in, for example, childcare or flexible hours. And if we do this only thinking in the women or only thinking in the men or only thinking in the child, you will never get the right combo, because the right combo is the three together, right? That's how we maximize. And so what is fascinating to me is that economic development is leading the way in economic thinking. Precisely my way of understanding is we really deal with reality, and reality as its more challenging fronts. And so it has forced us to say what our assumptions are is not what reality is. And therefore, we need to begin to rethink. And that's what the revolution, really, that experimental economics, mechanics economics, and so forth, has done. What's the problem there is that the assumption is still self-utility maximization, when in reality, we are not. And that's where, as I said earlier, integral economic development, the methodology, the theory and the methodology acknowledges, in fact, that the economic agent is fundamentally social and relational. And therefore, we're making these decisions which are therefore embedded in very complex institutional realities. They are taking into account, right, this social dimension. Right? And what we have found is that the outcomes and the explanations, the understanding of the process of maximization is much more accurate. They are more efficient, the outcomes are more efficient, and the interventions are sustainable.
Okay. So you mentioned, for example, this example of the family where, the father clearly isn't thinking in a completely self-interested way. Of course, there's the whole context of the household. How would some of that apply to institutions? I thought it was interesting what you said earlier about, we need democracy here. Let's give them a democratic constitution. Are there, in addition to there being, deeper levels of the human person to acknowledge, there's also the contextual, which might mean that the kind of constitution that we use, it might not be the right thing for everyone else.
Absolutely. We need to understand history, right? That's why it's so important to identify what we call those effective channels of relations, right? What are those relational dimensions in the life of the economic agent, in the process of decision, in the process of institutions that are effective in building those institutions, right? And so another important aspect of the sustainable development, and where I really think that the sustainable development goals perhaps can be enriched when it comes to the metrics, is that we need to acknowledge, right, that those decisions are made in a context, an institutional context, and those institutions means personal relations, specific personal relations. And let me give you a couple of examples. Where do we learn to be polluters? We don't learn to be polluters in college. We learn to be polluters at home. When you waste food, when you use too much water, when you leave the lights unnecessarily, when you create a mess or you have a culture of throwing out things. That's where we learn to be polluters. By the same time, where do we learn to have trust, which is fundamental for markets, fundamental for democracies, for transparency? Where do we learn conflict resolution, and where do we learn respect? All these basic virtues that we need for markets to succeed, for political setups to succeed, for a social community to exist and sustain in a diversified society, we learn it at the most basic unit, what we call the household in economics, but it goes beyond that. And we know that if you don't learn that at home, it's extremely difficult to learn it later, right? And so when we think about this, that from a point of view of integral development and from a point of view of economics, it requires from us to think very differently, measure very differently, in a much more integrated and comprehensive way than we are accustomed to.
And would you say, and here we might get into the overlap or conflict maybe when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and Catholic social teaching. You know, it seems that upon looking at the list of Sustainable Development Goals, there's very little about maybe character formation or some of what you're hinting at of the lessons that we learn at home and in the context of family and habits of virtue.
It talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions, right? But the point is, yes, the pathway begins at home and move forward. And therefore, if we need to strengthen those institutions, and that has many consequences. What type of immigration policies are in there? Do they break down the family or not? What type of trading or international arrangements are for maquilas, for or outsourcing? That's also important. So this goes down to very concrete things. What type of educational programs? What we are promoting? Are we promoting safe sex? So we are promoting, and we call that maternal health or women health, or are we promoting a much more wholesome, respectful engagement and management of affections? And so this goes down to very concrete things. And that's where I will agree with you that it's not that they ignore it, it's that just the framework is incorrect. Because once again, the assumption of who is the person instead of understanding it as for what we know it is the old assumption of self-utility maximization translated into the capability approach, which is the most, the main ethical framework used today in economic development.
So would it be too crude and simplistic to say that kind of what's missing is, if not faith, if not the church, so at least some sort of a formation of the person that has kind of a tradition of moral thinking and training of virtues, it sounds like is kind of the big gap.
Well, that's if we think bottom up, absolutely, right? Bottom up is that strengthening of those basic institutions at the local level and moving up. Corruption, and to the degree which we see at present today, and unfortunately not only in developing countries, more and more developed countries are beginning to look the same, is something that you can help from the top down, of course. There is police enforcement and so forth. But we also know from years working in economic development that that's not good enough. If you want an intervention to last and to start cleaning up, you need to start cleaning up from home up. Because are the communities that come together that clean up, right? And you see that again and again, for example, in where there are presence of gangs. And I'm not talking about anarchy. I'm talking about mobilizing the community to leave their responsibilities, right? In the place where they are. And little by little, you begin to clean up. I've seen it. I've seen it complete, entire provinces or departments in Latin America get rid of gang members, drugs, and so forth, because the community came together, right? The police was dysfunctional, so they came together, and not in an anarchic way, right? I mean, but a chaotic way, no, in a respectful way, but eliminating the evil by putting pressure and getting them out. And so, yes, today I would say that the top button, we need more money, we know is not the solution. It's the bottom-up approach that begins by engaging the local levels at all levels of the household, the mayor, the community, right? And unleashing that potential for people to be proactive and participatory. And that requires engaging, discovering what are those channels of relations that really lead to efficient outcomes and strengthen them. They are present everywhere. And at the macro level, I mean, we hear exactly the same thing, right? The new models that today are being used in the World Bank, et cetera, are not these general equilibrium models, and we assume the world are looking at the reality from a macroeconomic point of view and try to identify what are the bottlenecks, right? Are we understanding what are the problems instead of assuming all type of things and then not matching reality and creating a lot of harm in the process. So I don't want to say that they do not, the Sustainable Development Goals ignore this fact. Again, number 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. Number 17 are partnership for these goals. But responsible, right? I mean, they talk about sustainable cities, communities, responsibility. They do bring all these issues. The problem, I insist, I think, is the framework. They forget that we are social by nature and that we maximize as such.
Interesting. One question I've got, just in terms of the prudential, I suppose, of under certain steps that you undertake. I've often heard in the development context the importance of investment, opening up for trade and industry. But on the other hand, I've heard pushback that native industry can suffer or be sort of eliminated prematurely if too much investment comes in and it doesn't allow sort of the local businesses, I suppose, to kind of get on their feet and flourish. How do you kind of approach and resolve those sorts of tensions?
Okay, so this is very interesting. I mean, I always say that when you work in development, there are two things that are needed: magnanimity and prudence, right? Magnanimity, because you need to see what it could be, is not there. Prudence, because you need to know how to introduce interventions and at a timing, in a timing fashion and with the time necessary. What we know is quick solutions do not work. And it takes quite a bit of prudence, patience also, right? To be willing to work with the timing that the people need to change ways of operation and learn. So the issue of how fast we need to open the economy and what should be open first, right? Is the finances, is the financial sector, is the trading, is an old question that has been debated for almost 60 years right now. But certainly what we also know is that there is no formula, right? That we need to really understand the reality of that country, and that involves population structures, what type of infrastructure they have or is possible in a reasonable time, given the budget, is understanding the type of goods that they can produce or they can vertically integrate. And so there are many issues, right? The human capital available and so forth. So what we know is not only that one formula doesn't work for all, but that also we need to consider the impact of in the domestic markets across financial, consumption, production, etc., of opening the economy or right in its different dimensions. So as I said, there is a formula, no. What we know is opening overnight has not been successful. We have plenty of experience of that in Latin America. The one that worked very well was Chile, and Chile that did not open right away. They opened gradually. They used different types of capital control for a while until the economy was ready for that. And so we know certain things, but variations on the theme, because a country like Guatemala, for example, that opened the economy pretty quickly, improved quite a bit for a while until crime settled in. So that's where you see the variations on the theme, right? I mean,
and in some of your papers that I've taken a look at, you sort of contrast, I guess, some previous approaches to this idea of a more piecemeal approach. Could you talk a little bit about, maybe what has been
yes, and this is what I was referring before, right? This is the Millennium Development Goals was a perfect example of that. It was the top-bottom approach. You dictate at the top because you know better than the developing countries. You dictate at the top because you know what is right, and then you impose it. And it has been a massive failure. I mean, massive failure. And so that's why the economists, honest economists who look at the data without any agendas began to say, this is not working, right? This is not working. And so we need to understand more. And that's where the whole experimental bottom-up piecemeal of Easterly, to use Easterly's wording, piecemeal approach came in. Look, we don't know exactly how this works. While we learn, let's go and look at what really works and try to try to improve that intervention, and then in the process learn why it works, right? And that's what is called the piecemeal approach. In other words, start looking at the local level what works and start building from there. And that doesn't mean that you don't need also, of course, at the top of the governmental level, certain interventions, right? Like the justice system, like police, like, of course you do. But it's not all dictated at the top, right? It needs to be based on what is needed, not what I think is important, which is typically the approach of the international organizations. I think gender equality is important. I think, this country needs reproductive health, when in reality what they need is water, and they need the pipe here, not where for you is more convenient or economic. So this is where there has been really a transformation in that sense in economics. Not always perfect, because, for example, after the Millennium Development Goals that were, it helped, but really we know it was a massive failure. The impact evaluations show so. What we learned is that we needed to understand better, and we also, one way to invest in a more efficient manner was to bring those investments locally, right? So the private public sector initiatives, for example, in mining, in basic resources, right? Well, you come and you extract my oil, but we need a school, we need a road, we need, right? So is this back and forth negotiations at the community level, at these department levels, that has been very positive in many ways, but we also have learned that not everything is great, especially when we are thinking, for example, of the model of financing for China, that before you realize now we have a Chinese base in different parts of the world because China expropriated the property with that purpose, right? Or a port that is controlled by the Chinese military. And so we have learned that even with this good initiative that seem to be working, there have been mistakes as well. But it's better than throwing the money from the top and no effects in the bottom, right? And so, as I said, I think that in economic development, we have turned a big page. I think is going in the right direction. Countries have learned to be more engaged, also learning by mistakes. And people are looking at these things seriously. But again, yeah.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, just sort of the concept of there has to be a back and forth. Obviously, the local community. It's not just we come in with this intervention to make your life better, right?
Correct.
There's a community there that has its history and its context and its way of life that in many ways it probably thinks is very much okay and good as it is. And I think of the Amazon document of Pope Francis, which everybody looked. Does it approve of married priests or not? But we miss kind of the rest of the document, which seemed to be along the lines of your saying of the people who live in the Amazon and consider it their home. There has to be an integration of their heritage, their roots, and their culture with kind of the modernization and the development, which historically in many ways has just kind of come to them and hasn't given a chance for their culture to have a continuity into it.
Correct, or adjust. And there is a dimension here of prudence that I would like to highlight, because it's not small. We can cause a lot of harm in an effort to try to do good, right? And that is the process of development. Is a process, and process takes time. And so we have to be very careful when we want to advance a specific group by imposition and by pushing, because what is the fallback and what's the process of assimilation? And I give you an example, for example, that happens, is very much a hot topic right now in Central America. We do have, because of the increasing instability of insecurity, in the different cities, more and more bodyguards, right? It recalls the 70s and the 80s, right? When all the guerrilla work was taking place. Well, now it's drugs and it's organized crime. But then there is an increasing number of security, right? Now, this, for the most part, this type of profile is one that lives in very humble conditions, but from Monday to Friday, they put a suit on, they live in a world that they don't belong. They do have, they are armed, and then they go home, right? And the moment that it's such a contrast, it's like two lives that they don't match. There's no continuity to this, right? The moment they lose their job, they go back to this situation that is not desirable. They know something better, but they were never really, there was no transition in there, right? You can think the same for women. I mean, you can give them microcredit, you can teach them all type of empowerment, but then at the end of the day, what happens when that intervention was not well managed, there was no ownership, fell apart, and what is that woman left with? She's out of her place, and there is no place for her. And so I think that when we think about it, prudence and interventions, we cannot forget that the human person maximizes as a social person, is intertemporal, right? It maximizes intertemporally and intergenerationally. And if we don't take into account these three dimensions, we will never obtain sustainable development. If you think about integral development, just to go back to the proposal of the Catholic social doctrine of the church, right? They talk about integral development, really takes into place these three things. We maximize the social persons because we are social by nature, and the most basic unit is the family. We do, but it's not only the family, by the way. It's family, it's society, it's civic, right? There are all these three structures in addition to the church, which is a manifestation of our sociability too. But anyway, and it's intergenerational, because if we forget that, then we get the aging population problem, and the children who are the little emperors, like in China, right? Or that they don't take care of their parents. I'm never going to forget it when at a conference, the UN head for the aging populations, this was several years ago, she was proposing to outsource the elderly in Europe because they were a problem. And so out of sight, out of mind. So they had to outsource them. At the time was Indonesia, that was before the tsunami, and the Philippines, right? Because those two cultures take care of the old. But if you stop and think about that proposal, is it human? Right? I mean, where is the continuity? Where is the sense of belonging? That's inhuman. That's not efficient. Yeah. And then intergenerational and then intertemporal. Because when we make decisions, we don't think in the now. And if we do, we are inefficient. That's how we have problems with environment. That's how we have problems, right? We need to think the now, we need to think the now and the future. Is interpersonal, intertemporal. And so those three conditions need to be taken into account when we maximize, when we think of maximization, when we think of efficiency, and when we think therefore as policies or any type of intervention.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying is that to just take something like the Sustainable Development Goals on its own terms and on its own premises, you actually need an injection of this integral sense of the person. Otherwise, it actually won't even be able to be sustainable. I think of companies these days. It seems that there's so little investment in customer service. So, but the very lifeblood of what you're doing is trying to have customers who are satisfied and who keep coming back to you. You ignore them, right? So how do you keep up a business? How do you keep up a society? How do you develop a society if you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in a sense without bringing in the proper assumptions?
You can think about that. You can think about education and technology. Of course, technology has a role, but it cannot substitute the human touch in the process of education. It's all over the literature, right? And so forth. And at the same time, technology can be extremely useful precisely because infrastructure sometimes can be so expensive that technology can help us to cut through, right? I mean, you can think cell phones, it has such a powerful instrument in developing countries in so many different ways. So technology is necessary, but we cannot forget that, I always say something that sounds very strong, and I know it is, but I think it makes it very clear, and that is we need, as economists, if we want sustainable development, we need to put food at the table, of course, but we have to remember we are giving it to human beings, not to dogs.
That's a good point. Can you comment a little bit on, I think about, Catholic social teaching as a body is obviously something which, I think we would say it goes way back because the church has always had sort of moral teaching about how we work together for the common good as a society, but people commonly cite, Leo the 13th, for example, and Rerum Novarum as a sort of birth. Is there some sort of a different approach now that has arisen as a result of maybe the church's response to specifically modern problems in the industrial world, or do you think that this is just kind of a continuity with what's always come before, or are we talking about things in a new way given the modern context?
Well, I have to say there is, the basic principles of the Catholic Church, right? Dignity of the human person, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good. These four things have been always a point of discussion. But what I think today is different, is that because of the amount of data we have and the way economists are looking at this, they are pointing out to the right things. Sometimes they use even the right word. I mean, dignity of a human person is fashionable these days, right? It's very fashionable, but we understand it wrongly because we keep assuming this autonomy and self-utility and maximization, and that's to be dignified, and it's not. But what I think is that the church contribution today on those four basic principles certainly is being highlighted constantly by those working in economic development. And maybe we use participation. Maybe we use accompaniment. We don't use solidarity. Maybe we don't use subsidiarity, right? But we talk about agency. So yes, the answer to you is the teachings of the social doctrine of the church are extremely relevant today, and more the field, people in the field are addressing those four basic principles, again, calling them differently, and sometimes, unfortunately, with the wrong assumptions about the human being. But what I think is extremely positive and certainly has been revolutionary is that they, in economics, in the field of economics, is that we are addressing those four principles. And what we need now is a better understanding of the human person.
I seem to recall a cardinal mentioning, I think it was a Cardinal Sarah.
Sarah,
that, you know, we wish to eliminate destitution, but, you know, the idea of eliminating poverty, that there can be something that eclipses almost, you know, the goals of the faith, which, you know, always ought to be understood on an eternal horizon. Where, you know, talk to me a little bit about navigating successfully that, you know, obviously as the church, there's always been work towards helping the poor, building up institutions, building up societies, but making sure that doesn't become the end goal, that it doesn't become sort of a utopian desire to perfect the world, which maybe leaves aside the eternal dimension. How do
okay,
in
so
your
I think this is a very interesting question that you're bringing up, and something that we were discussing, in fact, yesterday in one of my classes, and that what is very interesting, because clearly the person, as the church remind us, right, we are made for much more. So when we are thinking about progress, material progress is not enough, right? We do need human flourishing, and that ultimately is heaven, is God himself. What I think is also very interesting is more and more people are realizing that void, right? And to that you have different responses, right? You have the transhumans movement that says, well, we want to be God, right? Almost Deus. This is, you know, God had it wrong. There's no God anyway. So it's very interesting, because I wonder who had it wrong. They haven't answered that question. But anyway, you know, they're going to become gods. That's what they are investing on, which with all this news that we are finding, maybe they might be thinking twice if maybe the genetic manipulation is not the solution. And then we have the other side that says there is something more. Yes, it's beyond the purview of our science, but there is something more. And people want human flourishing, people want happiness, people want to, there's something else they're looking for. Although I have to say, that's beyond our purview, right? I don't say it's not important. I just say this is not the realm of economics. And then there is another group of people that is still looking for material satisfaction. But I have to say, even among economics, when you look at the research that is happening, there is quite a bit of investment on happiness, of research on happiness, or on this accompaniment that I was mentioning before, in this participation, because they see that those are the pathways, right? So again, empirical evidence is driving that need for more. And so different researchers are looking at it in the same direction. But certainly, again, if we step back, I think looking at the body of social research, of the contribution of the social doctrine of the church is extremely enriching to development, right? Because it gives us an outline, it gives us principles upon which we can build. It doesn't give us a specific policy, but that's not the real, right? But certainly, I have to say, it resonates quite a bit all the way, even what Pope Francis right now is speaking, Laudate Si and so forth. It resonates to people in development because they see it. They understand that he is addressing issues that are real and that are not being well framed. So again, I do think that there is a lot of positive because people are open to see what the data has to say, and the data is speaking loudly.
That reminds me of a friend who works at the UN and who has mentioned that among folks there and diplomats and so forth, there actually has been a lot of enthusiasm for a document like Laudato Si of Pope Francis, which dives obviously into climate and environment, which is a very hot button temporal issue of the day, but he opens up the eternal horizon in a way along the lines that you're suggesting there.
I mean, we live in not only in surrounded by human beings, but also the environment, and we need to respect it. I mean, with it doesn't mean we need to adore the trees, but right, they are at the service of the human person. But there is such a thing, an ecosystem, and we see the problems that exist, right? Look at what's happening in Antarctica. Look at what is happening with droughts in Mali. I mean, we do have these changes that you mentioned earlier, the Amazon, right? I mean, they are real. We have to respect that. And that's connected also with this point that I think is well taken: responsible consumption, right? Responsible use of resources. The culture of waste is very much embedded in some of the developed countries, and we need to change that. But again, you can teach that at school, but it begins at home, right? Is that engagement in the home, which is not manipulation of the home, right? It's engaging parents and children so they do teach the right virtues, really, habits, if you may, that will make them flourish and therefore make everybody else flourish around them. So yeah, I think we are again going in the right direction.
It always comes back then, right, to the sort of core relationships, including family, and building out from there. And maybe to wrap up, we could ask, in what ways have you seen, I guess, it seems to me that this idea of integral economic and human development is kind of a churchy and theological thing in many ways, that it's something that, is that a conversation that's kind of been brought in from the more theological side into economics, or what has been some of the evolution of that concept?
Well, I have to say, within the personalistic dimension of economics, there is some stream that comes from really church teaching and move forward. I have to say, our integral economic development doesn't spring from there. If you ask me that it is if it is consistent with the social doctrine of the church, I would say absolutely. It is consistent, but it doesn't come from that space. It comes from a technical space of economics, of the science of economics, but that acknowledges this fundamental flaw that we have in mainstream economic assumptions, which is that the person is a self-utility maximizer, and that's so now. And to that, we respond, no, it does it, as I said, interpersonally, intergenerationally, and as a social person. And what I can tell you is 10 years later, since we began our this methodology implementation and policy design, it has been extremely successful and sustainable. And so I think we have enough evidence to show that this pathway seems to be more accurate, lasting, and efficient.
And so the interventions and so forth undertaken with these assumptions are in a sense, truly based in reality, yes, and therefore more successful.
In the reality of the human person, and right, in the reality of the human person, and that human person who is an economic agent. Because we need material things, we are not angels. So we do need to engage in economic activity. We all do all the time. So the question is how? And what we are trying to do is precisely highlight what are the hows and what are those pathways that make these interventions efficient, sustainable, and effective, therefore.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Aguirre, I want to be respectful of your time. If you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to give.
Except to thank you for inviting me. I hope it was a very interesting conversation, and thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And when you mentioned transhumanism, a light went off in my head, but I needed to restrain myself because that's a whole nother discussion in itself, I think. So
it is. Okay.
Excellent.
I'll see you.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.